What's Splashin'? And welcome to season 9 of Siren Sundays with me, your host, Ashawnte the Siren. Today is episode 1 of season 9, and our guest is none other than Ashawnte Russell. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's definitely a pleasure to have you as well. And just for some insight for some of my viewers, I not only know Ashawnte from being the Youth Climate Ambassador of the Bahamas, but also I had the pleasure of having her as an intern, I think like last year. So I've been so excited. You've showed so much promise and potential, and you're definitely fulfilling everything that I thought you would be able to do. And I'm so excited to talk to you about what you're doing now, and then even just talk to you about what you plan on doing as you continue to grow in climate action in the Bahamas.
Thank you so very much.
So we can start off definitely by just letting everyone know, who is Ashawnte Russell? What are you studying? What are some of your experiences that have brought you to want to advocate for youth in climate change action?
Yeah, that's absolutely no problem. So I'd say that this field has been something that's been an intimate part of my life for this year, make 5 years now. So essentially what my overall scope and goal is for the Bahamas as it relates to climate change is true sovereignty and resiliency. And that means so many different things to people, especially understanding or coming to understand what climate change is and how it affects us so dynamically as a small island developing state. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the work that I strive to do and have been doing is worked more so to providing the education and exposure for young people, particularly the youth, seeing that we are going to inherit this problem and are actively in the process of inheriting this problem. Yeah. And that's been the forefront and the main goal that I've been working towards to build that level of accessibility, because it's one thing to know that you're going to inherit the challenge, but it's another thing to not be as intimately as prepared as you need to be. So that's been the basis of what I've been striving to do, bring that level of accessibility and understanding to individuals within this generation to understand that, yes, it is a very technical and sometimes grim topic, but it is one that we have to have and have to continue to create space for, because it's not going to go away. Unfortunately, the time for us to no longer talk about it has passed, and we have to get to the level of comfort and, I don't want to say acceptance, but we have to live in that level of acceptance with what it is, the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it's definitely, and just like you said, it's no longer time to just talk about climate change and climate change is coming. We're literally living in the times of climate change is here. We just start action. We just start doing. And I just wonder, I know you said you've been doing it for about 5 years. What was it that inspired you to want to get into this? And I know you're currently a student at UB. Can you tell us a bit about what you're studying and what brought this on? Like, was it a childhood experience? Did you just feel this passion for the environment?
Yeah. So currently I'm studying a bachelor's of science in biology with a minor in chemistry. And usually whenever I tell people that is my degree path, and then I tell them what it is I do in terms of professional work, they always try to, correlate it. But, biology is a very broad topic, and there's so many subsectors and different aspects of accessibility within that umbrella that I decided, marine biology is something that it was really a big part of my heart and big part of my life. So I grew up pretty much outside. I grew up by the water. That was something that my mother made sure we had access to, that ability to just be in tune with nature. So growing up and snorkeling and going to different beaches, for example, you begin to, and that's another thing, people don't really always take into account that kids know, and kids actually notice when things are changing. So in snorkeling and noticing that, some animals were there 1 week and then they were gone the next, or the water extended out a bit more than it did maybe 2 weeks prior to. It was these subtle changes that I started to notice. But it wasn't until I kind of, around the age of maybe 9 or so, I saw an information broadcast for the island school. And they started to go more so into sustainability and what that entailed. I was like, okay, 2 things I took away from that broadcast. I'm definitely going there, for one. And for 2, I wanted to understand a bit more of what this world of conservation and sustainability actually was. So me being the person that I was, did my own little research, and I was pretty much presented with a whole slew of knowledge. That being, I learned more so about the UN. I learned about what they did. I learned about the many sub constituencies under that umbrella, because so much of the time I hear UN and I think it's just one thing, but that information overload was amazing, and it was something that I was really happy to stumble into. So correlating that now with, tertiary studies, I am definitely doing that degree in biology because I wanted the broadness and because I want to be able to function both in and outside of a lab. Biochem was the best option for me, especially knowing that I wanted to study locally and have that immediate access to the NGOs here. So it was a decision that I was really glad to make. Chemistry, as one of my lecturers often tells us, Dr. Dion Hepburn, rather, before I get, knocked out for misrepresenting the title.
Get
But he
it
often
right.
tells us, yes, he often tells us that, this is not a space for the weak. It's really a dynamic space, and you have to be completely aware of what it is you're signing up for, because otherwise it will eat you alive. So it's definitely been something that I've been really glad with that decision. But yeah, it was pretty much that intimate experience when I was younger that kind of got me on this path. And then what really got me more so into climate change, unfortunately, it was the turning point for so many conversations. But Hurricane Dorian being able to, and it was the worst possible situation that provided the best possible level of, I'd say, accessibility for us to actually learn that this is the worst possible situation we've seen to date, but it can get so much worse. And being able to see everything you studied actually like play out in that one storm, it was both frightening and concerning.
Yeah.
So I made the decision to more intimately add climate change onto my portfolio after, learning and hearing experts in the field say that this is bad, but this is what we've been trying to tell you for 30 years. This is what we've been trying to drill into individuals' heads, that SIDS are going to be the recipients of the most catastrophic outcomes of climate change.
Right.
So that was the catalyst for me.
Yeah, unfortunately, exactly what you said. We are going to be the first recipients of it, and we're the least contributing to the issue. But so, as the Youth Climate Change Ambassador, can you tell us about what this does and what does this mean for youth action in the Bahamas? Like, what is the Youth Climate Ambassador?
So this particular ambassadorship, it came out of, again, we learn and we develop such wonderful things out of the worst possible scenario. Mm-hmm. So this ambassadorship was enacted last year, and it came on the heels of COP26. What a lot of people don't realize is the events that occurred at COP26, which essentially was a final stand for youth, the tokenism, the inaccessibility, the inclusivity of youth in these spaces, that actually came to be from 2021. So I had the privilege and pleasure of going to the Youth for Climate conference that happened in Milan, Italy. And it was an eye-opener for me, to say the least, because not only were we in a space where we had to develop a manifesto that was presented at COP26 in about 3 days, we had to network with individuals from developed states as well. And there was one conversation point that we consistently bucked heads over, that being the accessibility for developing nations, especially SIDS, that rely heavily on tourism. And, we were trying to educate and expose them, because a lot of the time when you told them about the Bahamas, they assumed we were just one land mass. So it was a consistent run of education and exposing and enlightening. And when we came to a consensus, because, young people can be very headstrong in their mannerisms and their ways. When we came to that general consensus and understanding, we then were met with a whole new challenge, realizing that we were not being heard as well as we needed to be by a lot of individuals within those spaces. Yes, some were very open and accessible to us in terms of providing that multi-generational support, but others were not to that point as yet, and it became very frustrating. Mm-hmm. And it bubbled over on the last day when we realized that a lot of the conversations that we had were not taken into account. There were so many scripted dialogues. We just came to the conclusion that we were just here for days upon days, working, toiling late into the night, and a lot of the things we presented were not necessarily taken into account. Mm-hmm. So the striking, the planning, the spray painting, everything that happened in Milan was pre-planned the night we realized that we weren't heard. And it ended up transferring over to Glasgow. And I did not go to that particular COP, but in the conversations I had with a lot of the individuals that did go, they said that, it was they often say it's a necessary evil. It ended up being that. Like, they did not necessarily want it to go to that extent, but at the time it seemed and provided the best necessary outlet for those options to be explored. So this ambassadorship ended up being created because our leaders noticed that the Bahamas is not necessarily represented in the youth demographic in these spaces. We don't always have youth in these rooms providing this input or getting this experience for that matter. So yeah, this particular ambassadorship that I'm holding is the second installment coming out of that action.
Thanks for that. And I know I always try to be mindful of jargon, and I actually slipped this one. And we do have a perfect question from an audience member. D'Angelo asks, what is COP? So can you let us know what COP stands for? If you can share just a little bit about what COP is.
Yeah, that is absolutely no problem. So COP is basically the acronym for the Conference of the Parties. And it was first started in about, I believe it was 1995. And it came out of the general understanding or general conversation, rather, that climate change is becoming, or at the time was becoming, more of a prevalent issue. And there were individuals and scientists that were trying to essentially drill that into the heads of the international community for years. But it came to the point where individuals had began to state that, we need to have these meetings. We need to have a meeting, rather, in which we gather individuals from around the world, from both the developing and the developed nations, and have conversations about the prevalent issues that are happening in the world. So this year there will be the 28th session of the Conference of the Party that will be held in Dubai. And it'll essentially be taking the information that was established in the COP27. And, all of these COPs are connected in some way or some form in terms of, policy, because policy remains the same unless we find it to be ineffective. So there are conversations that happen with regards to revisements if necessary, depositions if possible, different conversations around what works, what doesn't work, and if it will work in the years to come. So that's essentially what that envelope actually entails. And the COP in itself it's a very, very dynamic space, because there's so many conversations and sub conversations that happen. And essentially it comes down to countries being on the same consensus and countries being on board before anything could be established.
So essentially, COP is this climate change summit, and all these countries have signed the United Nations Framework of Convention on Climate Change. And we love a good acronym, and that acronym is UNFCCC, and I think there might be a third C.
Yeah.
But thank you for explaining that. And I know we have another question from an audience member, and if you can answer, Gary asks, how inclusive of Bahamian youth will COP28 be?
So this year, similar to last year. So last year, let me start with that actually. We were able to have the first Bahamian delegation, youth delegation attached to the overall Bahamas delegation to COP. And that consisted of about 5 young people, myself included, that was able to travel along with our leaders and be a part of the process, learning about the things that actually happened, seeing it in real time, understanding why individuals may say, it's both a beautiful and crazy time, those 2 weeks in particular, because so much happens. And last year was also the first youth and children's pavilion that was incorporated into COP. So again, coming out of all of those strikes and protests that happened at the COP26, there has been more accessibility for youth into the space. But to answer that question more directly, this year, similar to last year, there will be a Bahamas youth delegation that will be attached to the overall Bahamian delegation. At present, it consists of myself, my fellow climate change ambassador, and about 4 additional people, 1 college student and 3 high school students that I have the pleasure to add represent islands outside of New Providence. If I'm not mistaken, we have another Mayaguana representative similar to what we had last year. Right. We have a representative from Eleuthera, and we have a representative from Crooked Island.
That's so awesome. I love the inclusiveness of it and the fact that it's not something that is Nassau centric. A lot of times here in the Bahamas, New Providence, Nassau, it's like that's the only island that exists and that have people living on it. So we often forget about the other islands, and some of them do have bigger voices because they are impacted or have been impacted a lot more than us by climate change. So thank you for putting that so eloquently, and I look forward to seeing that delegation head off to COP28. So one of the things I also want to talk about is we're talking about all this travel and COP and these things like that. You've obviously done a lot of travel in your role. And can you talk about that and some of the activities that includes? And what do you do when you go to these sorts of summits and climate change events?
Yeah, absolutely. So this year, thus far, I have had the pleasure, and I say pleasure completely, because every time you leave to go to these summits, it's very dynamic. There's so much that has to be done. So I've had the pleasure to be in Nassau up until this point. And I say that with complete enthusiasm because last year was extremely dynamic. But to touch base briefly on what last year entailed for me, my second involvement with the Youth for Climate that happened within Climate Week last year, September. That was an engagement that I attended, and it was essentially taking the conversation from acknowledgement to action. Because again, so much times in this space, we are stuck within the bubble of talking about climate change and talking about it. And you can talk about it a million times, but until you actually do something about it, you're not as intimately addressing the problem as you may think. Mm-hmm. So we began to more so mobilize what climate action is going to look like for young people. So that was the whole basis of the second Youth for Climate I attended. Within that same year, I also attended the 2022 installment for the ACE Hackathon, that being Action for Climate Empowerment. And it was more so focused around the energy systems between urban and rural areas for renewable energy within the scope of Germany. And for me, that provided so much context because, again, in the Bahamas, we are trying to establish commitments with the UN, that being our NDC agreement, which is a acronym for our nationally determined contributions, to have an energy commitment of about 30% by the year 2030. So being that energy systems is something that I have began to look at more intimately, and understanding that, all we have is sweet sunshine in the Bahamas, beginning to understand how to maneuver and mobilize that, especially within the scope of the Family Islands, because as you pointed out, a lot of the things that happens in the country kind of stays and pools in New Providence, and that's something that we are really striving to kind of even out, because at the end of the day, we already know that it's the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, not, Nassau and New Providence. So really trying to level out that conversation, because all we have in our Family Islands is room for opportunity and accessibility. So my area of looking more so towards renewable energy systems is more so going to be started and formulated in the Family Islands using what was deemed successful in Nassau. So that was the whole purpose of that engagement for me. And then last year, and closing out the year, was COP27 that was hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the biggest thing that came out of that for us was the approval of the Loss and Damage Fund. And to provide context for that, I'll use Hurricane Dorian again as an example. So economically speaking, Hurricane Dorian cost us about $3.5 billion in debt. And we lost so much infrastructure in those hours by which that storm just sat over our island. So essentially what Loss and Damage strives to do is to provide a pooling opportunity for countries that find themselves at the adverse and the most unfortunate end of the stick to have access to funds, because it's one thing to have to prepare for these storms. But again, in the case of hurricane season, we often are said we're in a hurricane belt. You cannot expect us to build resiliency if we have one hurricane coming Monday and we have a potential hurricane coming Wednesday. I'm still trying to relieve myself over what graced to me on Monday. I don't have the necessary options or resources to prepare for what's pending. So that's essentially what the fund is being essentially established around, providing that accessibility for countries and limiting the major issue that we always have. I have to borrow from countries that are more, contributing more to the problem. Yeah. The problem that I'm the recipient of, I have to then borrow money from them and return it at high interest rates. So the fund is trying to alleviate that as best as possible. It's not been launched as yet because there's still so many conversations around the mechanism and ensuring that it gets to where it needs to go and it's applied to what it needs to be applied to. But in the grand scheme of things, it is something that we can look forward to, and I'm hoping this COP is the COP that it's completely, the mechanisms are taking into account, and by next year it's something that SIDS can look forward to out of all of the, lack of a better word, cut up that we are taking because of climate change. It's something that we can look forward to.
Yeah, and you actually started to answer one of the next questions we have from D'Angelo. He asks, what are the main things the Bahamas delegations hope to have addressed at COP? And if you can't obviously answer officially, for the Office of the Prime Minister, I would want to flip that and ask you, what is something besides what you just said that you would like to see accomplished from this COP coming up?
It's absolutely no problem. So I will answer definitely in the individual scope because again, one of the main things I think I can say officially is that we are trying to mobilize our NDC agreements. Again, that being the nationally determined contribution. So two of our contributions for the Bahamas, that the commitment we made to the UN revolves around energy and the just transition. So 30% renewable energy within our grid system, as well as 35% of our vehicles being, of a green nature. So that is two things we are working on and trying to, actively progress towards. And I'm hoping within the scope of this COP, whatever accessibility or funding allocations can be provided to assist will better help us, to push in that direction.
Right.
But speaking more so unofficially, one of the main things that I'm really striving for is to see the broadness of youth inclusivity in these spaces. Because yes, last year there was a pavilion, and yes, there were some individuals that had delegations. But again, one of the most dynamic things I can say that I was really happy to learn with us having a youth delegation last year. There were countries, especially I have a few friends within the Indian delegation, and they came as standalone representatives because there are a lot of countries that do not include youth within their delegation. They're completely against it. They adamantly are opposed to it.
Wow.
So seeing more countries notice that we had that over the course of this year, I've spoken to several people and they're saying that their governments are actively engaging in those conversations to try and incorporate. I'm not sure how many of them will actually establish it. That's always a conversation that can go either way, but understanding that, that's something that they have taken into account. If it doesn't happen this year, that does not negate the fact that it may happen next year. So that was one of the things I was really happy to see. But I do hope to see the access for young people in these discussion spaces, the negotiating spaces, the bilaterals, giving us more access to be present. We are not necessarily asking for the platform to speak, but we're asking for the accessible point to learn, be in these rooms with these leaders and these veterans in the space of negotiations and learn what it is we can. So when we are given the platform to speak, we're speaking from an educated and a versed perspective.
It's beautiful. I hope that does come to fruition. And now I'm curious, what would you say your personal or professional vision for climate change action is in the Bahamas? Like over the next 5 years, what would you like to see done or strive toward?
One of the main things I think over the 5 years I've been working in this space that I'm striving for and I'm hoping to see come to fruition is a more sustainable and sovereign Bahamas. And I refer back to the COVID-19 pandemic. The one thing that I took away from that entire experience is that standalone as a nation, we're not prepared for the worst possible scenarios. We're really and truly not. In terms of imports, we import about 80 to 90% of the things that we use. And yes, there are things that we may not be able to create within our own spectrum of manufacture. That is completely understandable. But creating a more sustainable and sovereign food security system, again, referring back and the internship that I did alongside, which you really and truly contributed to that greatly, because understanding that there is a completely dynamic and dire need for us to revolutionize the systems that we have. Because again, when referring to the Family Islands, this is something that we're not aware of. Just about all of our family islands in particular have a capacity for sustainable agriculture and sustainable fisheries. It's a way of life. It's a traditional factor for the Bahamas. It's just we have to get to a point where we make it more streamlined, regulated, and secure. Because if the worst possible scenario arises, and for some reason we find ourselves in a global shutdown, we will be able to survive in what it is we had, because that is what got us through the last pandemic. Like in conversations with individuals from the Family Islands, I spoke to countless people, and the one thing they told me was, we have potatoes in the backyard. We can make our sauce. We have a yard chicken that's running around. Unfortunately, he did not make it out of the pandemic, but it provided some level of capacity for these individuals to survive. So essentially going back to our basic level of tradition and bringing it more so into that scope of 21st century regulation and mechanism. Once we secure and protect the products that we have, we will have something to refer to, and we can reduce the amount of things we import. We don't necessarily need everything we need, because I am so tired of getting a Chiquita banana, peeling it back and figuring out it was only yellow for being yellow's sake. we have so many things that we can lean on to that are healthy. They're more traditional. They provide a greater context, and it preserves our cultural heritage. Because at the end of the day, the Bahamas is a brand. We are known for so many things. We are respected and loved for so many things. We have to get to the point where, when we're looking at climate change, food systems, and resiliency on the whole, it's just one streamlined conversation. We have to be more appreciative and more aware of what it is we have, so we can understand exactly what it is we are being threatened with losing. Because worst case scenario, if we don't begin to have these conversations for climate change resiliency, the lovely conch salad that everyone loves will become a thing of distant memory. The islands that we are known for and we boast for, the Hotel Atlantis will become our designation on the map because the waters will claim us. We have to begin to understand that we have so much to be grateful for, and in the same right, to whom much is given, much is required. We have just as much to lose.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. And I'm hopeful that the direction that our government has taken will help foster that dream. I know I do my best, and I always try to encourage people, support the local farmers market. A lot of the lettuce and onions and things that you buy as staples from the food store that have been imported here, you can actually find at the farmers market on Saturdays and on Fridays. And, we are in a direction that we're moving to be a bit more sustainable as far as our food. It's going to take some time, and we're probably not going to get to 100%, but just reducing where we can also reduces things like the carbon emissions that we make. Like, I think a lot of people assume that, I want to buy the cucumber from here that was locally grown, but it costs a bit more than the cucumber that was like flown in from somewhere else. But if you can afford to, of course, be more sustainable, making those conscious efforts to pick local, it only gives you food that probably have less pesticides and, haven't traveled miles here in a plastic box and bag. It's actually better for you. It can be a lot better for you. And I always remember this lady that I met years ago who studied bees and said that if people eat honey, they really need to eat honey from the bees that are getting pollen from the areas that they live in, because a lot of times we don't realize that it's not compatible. So some people have actually thought that they might be allergic to honey, which is technically impossible. And I know I did mention something on carbon, and we did have a question in the audience that asked my wonderful Aunt Denise, who is one of my loyal viewers, what exactly are carbon credits? If you're able to answer it, you can go ahead, but I have the definition pulled. Do you want to share on carbon credits?
So what I'll do, I'll let you define it first, because there's a subsection that I do actually want to talk about it, but I want to definitely tie it to something that is definitely defined.
Yeah, no worries. So carbon credits are also known as carbon offsets. And these are essentially things that big businesses, corporations, or very rich people can purchase from countries that have areas of vast natural resources that store carbon, so that they can now say, well, I've purchased 1,000 tons of carbon credits, so now I can emit 1,000 tons of carbon. And if that made sense to you in the way that it makes sense to me, then you'll know that that's something that's not sustainable. And I know some of my colleagues don't share the same opinion as me when it comes to carbon offsets, because I just simply believe that it's not about trying to buy already stored carbon so that you can compensate and keep emitting more gases. It's really about reducing your emissions and reducing the amount of carbon that you're putting out into the area. So that's me on my little soapbox. I'm gonna let you go and take it and tell us about what you wanted to talk about in relation to carbon credits in the carbon market.
Yeah, most definitely. So I'll open by saying this firstly. I am by no means an individual within the space of economics. I know economics as far as understanding that I need this plus that in order to create something else. So I'm going to say that firstly. But secondly, when looking at carbon credits, it is a fairly new space, and it does have so many, things that are not as definitively understood about it, because again, this is a whole new spectrum for us. And when you hear about credits, and then it ties into things like currency or cryptocurrency, because that is now the way of the world, it creates a whole nother pocket of questions and concerns within itself. But from what I've gathered, especially looking in the scope of how the Bahamas is getting into it, so essentially, as you would have specified in terms of carbon credits and how we plan on getting into that space, or more so regulating that space, in terms of sequestration, and that being how much carbon is being trapped and maintained in an area, we're more so gearing that towards our seagrass beds. So in the Bahamas, we have to present assets to the UN in terms of basically making up what it is our credit, what our carbon emissions, the trapping of our carbon emissions is going to be accounted for. So the Bahamas has put forth our mangroves. So we cannot use mangroves as an asset for carbon credits because they already spoken for. They speak towards the amount of carbon we're removing from the atmosphere. That's the end of that. Mangroves, they're married. But as far as seagrass meadows go, that is essentially where we're tying our carbon credits to. So we had research done with Beneath the Waves. There was an article around a while ago speaking about how tiger sharks are being used to basically map out that specific area for us. So based on that, at present, I think we have about 92,000 and some kilometers of seagrass, in our water. So we are boasting the largest seagrass meadow in the world to date. Now, how that kind of fiddles its way into the whole carbon credit and carbon market system is because we are trying to apply that level of basic asset or economic asset to that particular ecosystem. So seeing that it's unspoken for as a regulatory asset, we're offering that up as something we can tie our carbon credits to. Again, let me remove myself by saying, as far as economics go, I understand it as far as, hey, this is something that we are able to present as a means for us to offer carbon credits or offer carbon certificates within the space of the economic world. Now, as far as it being sustainable, or as far as it having a long-term longevity in the space of carbon, climate change, because I can't even just say carbon emissions, because in the whole climate change conversation, there's so much I'm still learning about it. There's so much application and necessity I'm still gathering for it, because I'm a very simple person in this space. I like to put sense where sense is made. And as far as I'm concerned, if it provides a basis for us to actually level off emissions and it not encourage the creation of more, fine. But on the same token, if it does not do that or creates a pocket by which people are going to, there's a saying going pollute to play. If it encourages that, then again, that's a problem, because one of the main issues we have in the international space is a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability. People will go as far as you allow them to. If you give individuals an inch, they will take a mile, go around your backyard and come back. So if we're going to provide this option, we have to really gatekeep it and ensure we're not creating a problem while thinking we're solving another one. So as far as carbon credits go, I think that's all I'm going to say on the matter. It is, again, very new. Yeah, it's a lot associated with it.
Yeah, no, and I won't peg you as the official carbon credits expert and representative. And I think an important thing about having these types of conversations is simply what you did. You admit your level of ignorance and your level of understanding, and that creates the conversation to have with people who might share different views and beliefs on it. As I've already stated, these things have already been accounted for, and I think it gives big polluters. So I love the term you said. I've never heard that, pollute to play. Oh my gosh, I think them purchasing carbon credits and us selling our seagrass, and again, this is not me chastising you. I'm chastising no one, really. I'm just sharing, my humble opinion. I don't think us selling seagrass as carbon credits to big polluters is going to be something that is sustainable, something that does benefit us in the long run. Yes, it's going to make us a bunch of money, but a lot of things are making us a bunch of money. And look at the progress we've made in several areas across the country. So I won't turn this into something that's like very political or anything like that. But as far as with the question about what carbon credits are, it's definitely just in its essence, this whole 1 + 1 is 2. Carbon credits are a system for us to generate income using or leveraging our natural resources, such as mangroves and seagrass, which are known to be carbon storers. And I think the fancy word for that is carbon sequestration. Or if someone's watching and they can correct me, they can type that in the chat. But yeah, so I don't want to harp on that too long, but I do want to talk about, so you said to me earlier, and I know I read it and I probably missed it again, but you actually hold 2 ambassadorships that are both coming to an end. So can you tell us about the other one that you hold, and also say, what is next for you as you continue your journey and grow in your career?
Yes, most definitely. So within the scope of this ambassadorship, again, I work in a work of two. So there's me, myself, and Mr. Stephen Hunter. So we are hosting the position of the ambassadorships for this year. And we work in addition to a team of 7, that being representatives from, again, Grand Bahama, Exuma, Andros. We have a representative from Long Island, Mayaguana, and Inagua. So we have the Southern Bahamas pretty much covered in terms of ensuring that they're in that space. But this ambassadorship ends in March as well. Well, ends in March. My second ambassadorship is with the World Youth for Climate Youth to Youth Committee, Connect for Climate, and the Global Youth Network. So it's formerly known as the Max Labiso Atkins Climate Ambassadorship. And Max Labiso essentially was an individual that pretty much tried his best to create opportunities of accessibility for young people to actually be able to have a seat at the table, access to education, access to inclusivity. He went the 9 yards, and unfortunately, he died in 2018 via a helicopter crash. So what the organizations he was associated with wanted to do was create an ambassadorship that completely aligns with what it is he had established and continuously provide the opportunities for young people to have that level of accessibility. So that ambassadorship ends in January for me next year. So the next steps really after which, firstly, referring back to the Youth Environmental Committee that I mentioned, we are definitely trying to come together as a more regulated group, just a standalone youth committee that's more focused on youth empowerment, youth accessibility, and providing the option for young people to have access, ready access more so to funding. Because again, one of the challenges I'd say that young people that we have and that myself and the committee has had has been that accessibility to funding, because you could have so many wonderful, lovely, dynamic ideas. And again, if you lack that portfolio, there's only so much you can do. And yes, there are people that provide funding or whatever the case may be, but it's not always as accessible to young people. And this is another reason why we get a little rambunctious in the international space, because there's so much that we know we can do. And when we try to strive for that multi-generational conversation, we're either met with 3 spheres of the conversation. We're not educated enough, we're not exposed enough, or we're not as, experienced. But we are trying to come together and pretty much fill in those gaps. Because if we are educated, we are exposed, we are encouraged and empowered, we can actually go after that multi-general collaboration and have those conversations. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that I've learned in this whole scheme of working in this space is if you don't have individuals from the youth sector, the governmental sector, and the NGO sector, there's not much that can be completely accomplished. You need these 3 perspectives as you're going to have a completely sustainable society. Mm-hmm. The government, they have that, most of them have that access to funding or have that access to portfolio or the means to strive to get funding. The NGOs in most cases, have the best perspective on what's going to work for the environment as well as what's not going to work. That's the whole spectrum of what they strive to do. And again, as the young people, we are going to strive into either capacity. Some of us are going to go into government, and some of us are going to go into the NGOs. But at the end of the day, in the space that we are in, we are a completely flexible and malleable group. We need to be given the necessary information, the necessary accessibility. So when we do fill these shoes and we do fill these chasms, we are equipped to prepare the group that's going to come behind us. Because just as you change socks, once we are heralded into this new world, there's a whole nother set of individuals that's going to come behind us. So that is definitely, in terms of working, what's going to be the main thing that we strive to do. Because if myself and my committee have learned anything in the last 2 months, this space is not the easiest to navigate. It can be very, very difficult. And sometimes it can be very frustrating when you have a lack of certain things or you're not taken to the level of accessibility that you need. In the secondary sense, I do plan on pretty much finishing off my bachelor's degree and then navigate. Yes, praise the Lord. And navigating the whole master's conversation. Like I was telling you, I am still going to pursue marine biology more so in a portfolio. So I'm not going to do it as a standalone degree, but more so in conservation research. So that's going to definitely be one sector. But I have developed a very strong love for renewable energy systems. So that's going to be something that I go more intimately in. And I'm definitely sticking within the space of international relations and climate change policy. So the goal, as was when I was about 9 and 10, is definitely the UN. So I'm going to definitely remain a delegate for them. I've been a delegate working with them for the last 3 years, so I'll definitely continue with that.
Yeah, and I thank you. I do want to highlight this comment by Teru, one of my dearest friends, who's also in a small island developing state of the Cook Islands. Rich countries who say they should just restart. Rich countries who say they care could just pay us for the services and for our protection of those services that our island ecosystems provide intrinsically, rather than pay them for an excuse to pollute more. So I think that's the biggest take-home message. Like, this is, the carbon credits are essentially them paying to pollute more. But I know Gary asked a question, and if you just like succinctly answer, what role does the Youth Climate and Environmental Committee play in the fight against climate change?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. So the committee essentially was founded to support and directly provide a level of accessibility for Bahamian youth. So yes, the two ambassadors for this particular year, we worked within a team of about 7. So inclusively, there are 9 of us that work within this space. And we are striving, or we actively are striving to encourage and implement more programs within the youth spectrum. So over the course of this ambassadorship, we have been able to collaborate with countries like India in the beginning of the year for a conversation between the Bahamian youth and the Indian youth, coming to a consensus as to what climate change is, what it's causing us, and as young people, how we can be more intimately involved in the conversation. We've had conferences surrounding sustainable agriculture and hydroponics, and moving more so into 3D printing, because again, the world is changing and we are striving to change with it. Yes, 3D printing is a very expensive sector, and seeing that we are a country that we're in that, lunch money phase where we are trying to allocate funds where funds need to go, it is still a conversation that we are striving to foster, because it does assist us in building resiliency, especially in the space of agriculture. And our main endeavor was the Bahamas Youth Climate Conference, the first of its kind, that was hosted in July. So the Youth Environmental and Climate Committee we were the driving force behind it. We essentially worked to create a product and a space by which young people were educated by young people, encouraged by young people, and there was a conversation about what climate change means, is, and can be for young people. So it was definitely a youth-led, youth-regulated event by which we wanted to begin to empower young people to understand that you're never too young to get into this space, you're never too young to be guided, and if accessibility is provided, much can be accomplished. So essentially, that's going to be our mandate for the rest of our term. We are going to be moving more so into striving for more off-island. When I say off-island, I mean specifically Nassau. So off-island endeavors, because we have representation. Yes, we have representation from quite a few islands. So we are striving to get more done within these spaces, and essentially close out with a better and more intimate acceptance that, our young people, we did our complete best in bringing them into this space. So by the time we leave, we can say, what, the next ambassador has a platform to work with rather.
Yeah. And I love that you actually ended up answering another question that we had from Amber. Are there any initiatives the committee is currently involved in? And as you said, so the main objective of this committee now is to continue these youth conferences then.
Though that is one thing that we would like to see continue happening into the future, because again, climate change is going nowhere, and there will be people, and there are people that don't necessarily understand, and most of the time, education in the household tends to come from young people, them bringing back what they learned and it being disseminated within the household. So that is one thing we are striving to continue. In terms of initiatives, we have committee members that are intimately involved in programs, and I'm extremely proud of them. So 2 of our committee members are involved in an international climate negotiations program, and it is definitely dynamic. I feel for them a lot of the time, because it does call for a lot of effort, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm hoping that the takeaway is a greater perspective and capacity on climate negotiation. So that is one initiative that they're involved in. And then we have a committee member, I'm hoping a lot of you may have noticed on Facebook. She was involved in the United Nations General Assembly conference that was hosted, or is hosted, in New York. And she's involved in the International Climate Delegation Program to the COP28 presidency. So we're definitely working on the grounds and behind the scenes and trying to build as much resiliency as possible in a space that is beginning to become more inclusive of youth. It's baby steps, but definitely working.
And so is this committee, I know Gary asks, will this committee be presenting at the next COP at all, or accompanying as a part of the delegation for the Bahamas? Did we lose you?
So that is something that we're definitely striving for. So we will have oops. Okay. You can see me? Because I think I dipped out.
You're back.
Okay, wonderful. So, okay, great. So we do have young people that will be accompanying our delegation. To say whether all of our committee members will be in that space is to be determined. It's something we are striving for. But again, it's the best possible outcome, but again, may not be the case. It's something that I would very much love. But again, that is something that we will see. In terms of what it is we are striving for in the long term for COPs, it is a hope of mine that young people are continually involved in this process and given access to this process. Nice. So in partnering up with my secondary organization, that being the World Youth for Climate Justice, we are trying to create more accessible outlets for individuals to be involved in this space. And essentially just briefly stating what that organization stands for. So essentially, it's tied to the International Court of Justice and the advisory opinions particularly. So we are striving to encourage and basically derive state engagement and state commitment from as many countries as possible. And the Caribbean region did not have a front for various reasons and difficulties. So I'm now tasked with the creation of the front, the implementation, and ensuring that Caribbean countries, or Caribbean identifying countries for that rather, are implemented in the space. So definitely we'll be juggling opportunities for access, opportunities for education. Yeah, definitely striving to create as much accessibility as possible. Again, it's a fairly new space, so accessibility, providing opportunities for Bahamians to attend this COP was something that I strived for, but it will be limited because we are new. But hopefully next year we will have the capacity, to make that possible. So fingers crossed for that, because that's really one of the things I'm striving for.
I got that. And and we do have a little bit more time and two more questions that I'll actually combine. So Raquel asks, how can interested youth apply for this ambassadorship after your term ends? But also Amber asks, would you recommend this position to other young individuals? So I want to merge these two and basically ask you, what types of individuals should apply, and how can these individuals apply for this position next year?
Okay, so I'll take the first part of the question first. In terms of what I would say to my successor, it is not an easy space to navigate. It comes with a lot of give and take. Honestly and truly, there are some nights when we do sit down and we have to continuously kind of revise and take into account what it is that we really want this ambassadorship to amount to and what it's going to basically mean for the Bahamian youth. Again, I made the decision to step away from just about everything that I was doing internationally last year to pretty much focus on this. So my main objective and my main goal and my main hope is for when I go back into this space promptly next year, I see more young people in that space. I see more young people being aware and versed and having a greater understanding and capacity. So for my successor, before you make this decision to strive and come here, you must understand that it is not all fun and roses. It comes with a great level of responsibility. It comes with a lot of give and take. It comes with a complete understanding or need for understanding that sometimes geopolitics will take precedence over what it is you want to do, especially if it doesn't align with the overall goal of the ambassadorship that you signed on to. Yeah. It comes with understanding that you may not hit all of your target goals, because there were so many more target goals that we as a committee had, that we may hit some of them, but reasonably we won't necessarily hit all targets. So it comes with an understanding that, even when things don't necessarily go the way it is you want to go, you have to have that level of understanding that this position is more than me. It's something that I signed on to for others. This is literally an act of service, and it comes with being a complete steward as well as, in most cases, a mentor for somebody else. So if that is something that you can step up and do, then you will do well. But yeah, understand that it will come with a lot of work.
Yeah, and so when is there going to be the call for applications, or like how would someone be able to see when they can apply for something like this?
So I do believe it'll be similar to what they did when we applied. So essentially, at the closing last year of COP27, it was announced that they would be onboarding their next ambassador. So seeing that our term ends in March, more than likely there will be a publication of information around, let's say maybe mid-March, if that, maybe mid-March to April, around that window of time, they'll begin advertising for our successors. So you could probably tune in definitely to the climate change environmental and advisory unit of the Office of the Prime Minister for that information for sure. The age requirement is definitely 18 years. So if it does maintain the current specifications, you would have to be between the age of 18 to 25. So that would be the main specification for that.
Awesome. And so we have two more questions from me. I don't see any more in the audience. I know I have your handle up here, and so people know how to reach out to you directly, obviously, if they want to chat or just follow your journey. But for you, who is someone in the sector, whether they're locally based or someone international on the global scale, that inspires you, and why?
Boy. So I'll start locally. So let me firstly say there are countless individuals in the national space that inspire me. And sometimes when I sit down and think about it, there are too many to count. But off the top of my head, I can reference Dr. Del Thomas and Dr. Anselino Davis. Those two individuals really have the work that they've done, the work that they're doing is something that kind of pulls me back, because I will say, working as a delegate, in addition to working as an ambassador, sometimes those portfolios do buck heads. Mm-hmm. And I have to sit down and say to myself, you know what? This is going to make sense. This does make sense. And when I look at the work that they've done and the work that they're continuing to do, I say to myself, you know what? It has its precedence, it has its ability, it has its capacity. And if these individuals can continue to do this despite the odds that they definitely face, working with so many different people, it's something that I can refer to. In addition to the late Gary Anderson, most people may know him as Gary the Explorer. He was someone that pretty much got me going over the years and got me more involved and interested in the whole environmental space. And sometimes when I get really beat up, I do refer to his old videos and publications, because he was definitely a dynamic force and someone that I still hold great respect for. In the international space, as she is called by so many people in the international community, the Prime Minister for the Caribbean, the Honorable Mia Mortley. Yes, she is someone that I definitely look up to, because she's gone in conversation spaces with people that have tried to denounce the seriousness of what climate change means for the region. Mm-hmm. And she not only advocates for her country, Barbados, but she takes the fight for SIDS to the top mm-hmm. of the hill. Yeah. So definitely
we love Auntie Mia. Yes. as we so affectionately call her. Yes. But yeah, a lot of inspiring people. I've actually never heard of Gary Anderson, so I'll take some time to read up on him. But as we close out, what would you say is like maybe a quote that you live by, or a lesson that you learned, or a mantra that you say to yourself as a final thought that you would want to leave for our viewers who are watching today?
So there has been a saying that I've adopted over the last 3 years in particular. You know, because so much of the time in the climate change space, we always look at it as a us versus you, or a me versus you. Mm-hmm. We always tend to look at it as an opposing thing, because at the end of the day, there is patriotism and we do have our own duty to our countries. But at the end of the day, climate change is multi-sectoral, it's multifaceted, and it's a domino. Once one region goes down, it's coming for another one, and it does not discriminate. So the one thing that I often tell people is that we are definitely connected through climate, but unless we take the meaningful steps and actions to preserve country, state, life, and people, we will be truly connected through action. So unless we get to the point where we put life above profit, we put people beyond economics, and we start to truly take ethics into account, we will not be connected through climate until we are connected through action.
I love that. That's such a potent thought to leave with. But thank you so much, Ashawnte, for coming on the show and taking some time to chat with me on this beautiful Sunday evening. Thank you to all my guests who have tuned in for another season of Siren Sundays. I'm so excited to have spoken with you and for all the rest of the guests of the season. So keep riding this wave with us. And Ashawnte, I hope you continue to ride the wave with me too. Hope to see you all soon. All waves yours, Ashawnte the Siren.
Thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome.